Welcome, everybody, to Tokens of Wisdom. I'm your host, Dave Rothschild, a partner at Cole, Freeman & Mallon, based in San Francisco, and nobody's joining me today. It's just me. We're going to talk about a couple of no-action letters the SEC released this week, last week. Not sure when this thing's going to get published, but recently, and it's really exciting stuff. But before we dive into all that, please remember to listen to the disclaimer at the end of the show. Nothing I say here is legal advice. Nothing I say here is investment advice. Certainly nothing I say here is tax advice. And yeah, so please listen to that disclaimer. And now we can get on with the fun stuff. Well, it's been a banner week for SEC actions. Or should I say, no actions. Get it? That's right. The last 2 days of September, the SEC issue two back-to-back no-action letters that impact the crypto industry. These no-action letters drive additional nails into the coffin of the Gensler-era SEC's regulation by enforcement approach to crypto. So, taking them chronologically, on September 29th, the SEC issued a no-action letter to DoubleZero, confirming that based on the facts laid out in DoubleZero's letter to the agency, its 2Z token is not a security. Now, there's a ton of detail in the request for no action relief around how the token works and why that's important to this analysis, but at its base, the SEC is saying that this token is being used to encourage activity. It has real utility. It's distributed as a payment to specific parties for performing services to the network that DoubleZero designed. It is not being sold to investors for speculation. Now, I'm going to give you a very high-level rundown of how this cool DoubleZero network works, because it's way too complicated for a slowpoke like me to understand. So if you really want to understand it, I very much encourage you to read the full letter that DoubleZero submitted to the SEC. It's super interesting, and if you're smarter than me, maybe you'll understand, like, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4 of it, something like that. So basically, DoubleZero is setting up a real-world network. Think of it like an alternate internet to provide faster bandwidth than the boring old regular internet can provide to people or businesses willing to pay for that super speed. Its 2Z token is something that it's going to pay out to people or businesses who either provide services or infrastructure for building this complicated network in the first place. And then if someone wants to use that network and access that super fast alternate internet, the way they access that is, yep, you guessed it, by paying in that same 2Z token. So the 2Z token is issued to people for building the network, and then those people can sell it to others who want to use the token to access the network. Now, DoubleZero acknowledges that secondary markets will probably develop in which trading of this token will occur, but that doesn't change its fundamental characteristics. It's distributed to people providing services to the network, and most subsequent sales will be to people who want to use that token within the network. Shockingly, the SEC comes out in a formal no-action letter and agrees that this is not a security. It's unbelievable. There are so many contrasts here from the Gensler-era SEC that I'm only going to highlight a couple that matter most to me, because otherwise we would be here all day. Number one, collaboration over combat. The SEC actually engaged in a dialogue with DoubleZero. They got to understand this DoubleZero network, how it works, how the token works, how it's issued, and then they proactively issued no action relief. The Gensler-era SEC did not collaborate with the industry at all. Instead, they went to war. They fought combat. They sued. They enforced against operators in an attempt to chill any sort of economic activity in this realm. Whether you agree with the specific securities analysis under the Howey test that is laid out in the DoubleZero letter, which the SEC ultimately agreed with, I would suspect that most people can agree that government's willingness to collaborate with industries, to work with a novel enterprise, is better in the long run for the economy and for the country than is some heavy-handed enforcement approach that chills innovation. Super important stuff. Number two, scalpel over sledgehammer. This no-action letter marks a significant departure in how the SEC will apply the Howey test under this regime compared to how the prior SEC applied the Howey test. Now, we knew this, of course, already based on the fact that they've dropped a million enforcement actions. They've issued some statements that suggested that they viewed the Howey test differently than the prior SEC did. But here is another formal letter confirming the same. It's a significant step in the right direction. You know, the Gensler SEC took what I call a sledgehammer approach. It assumed that all digital assets were security, and it viewed an asset's potential value appreciation as conclusive that it met the Howey test, as if the concept that something might be worth more money tomorrow than it is today necessarily makes that thing a security. I think we all know that that's not the case. This SEC seems to acknowledge that also. This SEC is taking a much more nuanced look at the various elements of Howey. Sure, it's possible that someone could profit from selling their 2Z tokens, but the tokens are paid to people for providing real-world services to a real-world network. The network is only going to grow if those people continue providing those services, and therefore, if someone's buying the 2Z token, expecting it to be worth more so that they sell it for a profit, that expectation is not based on the efforts of the centralized party promoting the network. It's based on the efforts of all these disparate people in the decentralized network that are participating in building it. Totally different way to look at Howey and its various elements than the prior SEC gave. Now, one note of caution, this does not create some green light for everyone to issue tokens willy-nilly without considering securities law's implications. The reasoning in this letter applies only to the specific facts and circumstances described therein. It is not a new law, it is not a new regulation, but it does evince a regulator that's willing to collaborate and that will actually evaluate each given project based on its facts and circumstances, not on some preconceived notion of what is right and wrong. And that, my friends, is progress. Now, the second no-action letter I want to talk about came out the very next day on September 30th. And this one deals with custody, specifically crypto custody. Yes, my favorite topic. I have talked at length on this show, both to myself in a setting like this, and to Commissioner Hester Peirce, among other people, about the issues RIAs investing in digital assets face with custody rule compliance. They are deep, they are glaring, and they need to be resolved to bring the regulatory clarity that we all crave. This no-action letter inches us ever closer to that clarity. To borrow my regulatory ladder analogy from the Hester Peirce episode, we're still on the vibes rung of the ladder, but we finally have one hand firmly planted on the next rung up. So, what does this letter say? Well, it says that as long as certain specific conditions are met, the SEC will not recommend enforcement against an RIA that treats a state-chartered trust company as a bank for purposes of the custody rule. In other words, state-chartered trust companies can safely be considered qualified custodians under the custody rule for crypto assets, again, as long as certain specific conditions are met. Those conditions include: 1. The RIA has to conduct an assessment of the trust company, both initially before engaging them and on an ongoing annual basis. And pursuant to that assessment, the RIA has to conclude that the trust company is, paraphrasing here, legit. You know, they have to be able to custody assets. They have to have adequate policies and procedures to safeguard assets, yada, yada, yada. All the usual stuff that a diligent RIA should be trying to figure out before it entrusts client assets to any custodian. Honestly, there's not a ton new here in this condition. I mean, most RIAs are subject to a compliance requirement to annually assess their various service providers and vendors to make sure that there's no red flags there and that they're using providers that are legit. And so this is kind of goes along hand in hand with that already existing obligation. Second, the RIA has to have a written custody agreement with the trust company that prohibits the trust company from unauthorized rehypothecation or pledging of client assets, and requires the trust company to segregate client assets from their own. The RIA also has to disclose the risks associated with these custody arrangements and with state-chartered trust companies specifically. Honestly, you should be doing that anyway if you've listened to my show and engaged an attorney to assist you in the launch process and putting together your fund offering documents, which should always disclose custody-related risks. And the custodian has to provide audited financial statements, robust internal control reports, etc. This is an important step. It ends the Ross and Rachel question about how state-chartered trust companies fit into the qualified custodian definition. Will they or won't they? Well, now we know they will. I suspect, as I mentioned before, though we're still at the vibes rung of the regulatory ladder, this is but a preview of what's to come. I foresee. Never listen to someone who foresees anything, but I believe that in the relatively near future, we're going to see proactive rulemaking that governs custody, that touches on custody and specifically crypto custody. And I'm more optimistic now for the regulatory future of the asset class than I ever have been before. Well, now that all that boring stuff's out of the way, it's time for the part you've all been waiting for. The legal disclaimer. In this show, I describe laws and regulations from a 10,000-foot view. And while this should be obvious to most, I need to say it nonetheless. This show is for informational purposes only, and nothing I say here constitutes legal, investment, or tax advice. If you're thinking about starting a fund or you're curious about your options, this show is a good resource. But if you're going to pull the trigger and launch a fund, please engage an attorney to assist you.